Welcome to the webinar. Okay, let's get started. We're really excited to have you here, and we're very, very excited about this presentation. The presentation will go for 1 hour. We'll have some brief introductions, and then we'll get started right away with the presentation by Dr. Paul Lawrence, Becoming a Systematic Coach. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Angela Wright, who will be introducing Paul. And we thank Angela for spearheading this event and putting it together. Thanks, Angela.
There you are. Okay. Spain, Portugal, Japan, and Australia. He's an experienced coach, facilitator, writer, and researcher. He teaches coaching on the Master of Business Coaching program at Sydney Business School, and he also currently serves as the president of the New South Wales branch of the ICF. He's published several academic journal articles and book chapters, and in fact has 2 books due for publication later this year. This session's based on his new book, Coaching in 3 Dimensions, I believe. Paul's got an MBA from the University of Warwick, has his PhD in psychology from University College London, and attained his coaching supervision credentials at Oxford Brookes University. So I think we're in for a bit of a treat tonight, and no pressure, Paul. Well, before I hand back to Julie, I just wanted to thank Julie for the efforts that she's made in making this webinar happen. So thanks, Julie.
Oh, I'm happy to do it. I'm really excited for this presentation this evening. Just one more quick thing before Paul begins. We will be having polls of 2 varieties this evening. One will be just simply answering in the chat box, so hopefully you've now familiarized yourself with that location. And then the second thing will be to just answer a poll that will pop up on your screen. So I see someone has annotated. I don't know if that's me, hopefully not. But let's try not to use the annotation tools if we can. Thanks. Okay, Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Well, let's see if I can get the... How's that? Can you see the slide?
Looks good.
Cool. Lovely. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for the introduction. Right, so I've divided this, Becoming a Systemic Coach, I've divided this webinar into 2 parts. In the first part, I'm going to give you a basic overview of some of the theory underlying this. And I'm going to try and keep that as concise as possible. And then in the second part, some practical nuts and bolts ideas as to things that you can start introducing into your practice immediately, if you're not already doing so. Now, there's a lot of good stuff happening in the systemic space, inverted commas. So there's constellation work, John Whittington's stuff, psychodrama, Claudia Filtinger's doing some good stuff in the UK. And that's all good. That kind of stuff generally requires a bit of investment in training. Today, I want to cover some stuff that you can just start doing immediately. First thing for Deb, I think, as well as others, is I feel the need to define that term systemic. And the way that I define it isn't necessarily going to be the way that other people define it. So let me distinguish between systematic and systemic. Now, the analogy for systematic would be like an aircraft engine. It's all very complicated, and I doubt whether there's anybody on the call who quite understands how it works. But if we spent a long time reading the manual, then we might work out how it works. With a systemic system, and the analogy there would be like a weather system, it's so complex and so volatile that we can't really ever fully understand it. So I just want to pick on those 2 words, complex and volatile, and refer to this popular acronym VUCA, a term which I believe emerged in the military in the 80s and 90s to describe how war was becoming more complex. So in World War One, you had a lot of soldiers on one side of a battlefield and a lot of other soldiers on the other side, and it was pretty evident who won. Whereas I recall, as I'm sure many of us do, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, capture of Saddam Hussein, toppling of statues, and thinking the war was won when it was actually just the start. And let me pick on that word volatile. If we go back to the aircraft engine analogy, imagine if you did spend 6 months reading the manual and you finally understood how a jet engine worked. If it was a complex system, by the time you'd come to understand it, it would have evolved and it would have changed all over again. And that's the nature of a systemic system. So one characteristic of a systemic coach is like Alfred E. Newman. The catchphrase is, well, what me worry? A systemic coach is aware of the system and at the same time is comfortable not fully understanding it. There's a big aspect of exploration. I contrast that to issues that coaches often bring to supervision. Concerns, for example, I just can't get this person to I just can't nail this person down to a goal. Or I need to get them to commit to clear actions and they won't commit to clear actions. Or the coachee came back to session 2 and they hadn't done their homework. What have I done wrong? Or what are they doing wrong? Are they really committed to coaching? From a systemic perspective, we have a different view on these things. Now, I'm going to come back to the systemic perspective in a moment and pick up on those kinds of conversations. But first, I want to contrast it to 2 other approaches first. And this model is the model that sits at the heart of the coaching in 3 dimensions that Angela was referring to. And this is a book that I co-authored with Alan Moore. Alan Moore is the head of Cornflowers Global Coaching Practice based in the US, and we've written it together, and it will come out in August, September time. Now, so I haven't got time to explore the whole model, but today what we want to look at is these 3 approaches to one-to-one coaching: traditional, dialogic, systemic, as they apply to individual coaching, one-to-one coaching. And if we have time, I'll touch base a little bit on the development bit at the bottom as well. So let's just illustrate. So here's a traditional approach to coaching. Adam says, I want to become more influential. Jill says, what would it be like after I become more influential? Adam says, people will more readily accept my point of view. How influential are you now? Not very is what it feels like. What could you do differently? I could speak up more often. What else? I could spend some time preparing in advance. Any other possibilities, etc., etc. And ultimately, Adam ends up slightly doubtfully committing to go on a Toastmasters. Now, notice that Jill, in this instance, has been very successful in getting Adam to agree on a goal. And he's got some actions. And by the way, you can, if you look at it carefully, you can see that what Jill's been using is the GROW model. Now, what I'd like to be really clear about saying is that I'm absolutely not trashing this approach at all. The traditional approach may well work very effectively in some instances. The premise that I'm sharing with you is it may not work well in all instances. And in this particular case, we can see Adam's not really committed to his actions. Now, here are it says 5 aspects. I must have deleted one. Here's 4 aspects of traditional coaching. Typically, it's 2 people in a room. I did a little bit of research on supervision a couple of years ago and spoke to one coach who said, yeah, coaching is me and the coachee. That's my job. And I don't like all this stuff about meeting with line managers. And if that's how the coaching industry goes, then I'm going to stop being a coach because it's all a bit stressful. For this traditional coaching, it tends to be coaching coachee. It's strictly confidential, often the traditional approach. So if you, organisation, want to know what my coachees, how they're experiencing coaching, well, the best thing is you ask them. Lots of talk about active listening. I'm not terribly sure what active listening is, and we'll talk about that later. And there's this very strong focus on goals. So that's the traditional approach. Nothing wrong with it. That's the traditional approach. Now, if we look at dialogic, this is the bit of theory that I think this is the most complicated theory. I need to explain what I mean when I use the word dialogue. And I'm going to use this little diagram here, which is a Bill Isaacs diagram from Dialogue and the Art of Thinking Together. Basic premise here is when I come to any kind of conversation, when I come to any type of conversation, I have a choice to make. Am I going to really listen without any parameters at all, without any assumptions, without any prejudice? Or am I listening with some parameters in mind? Now, if I choose to listen without any assumptions or parameters, then that's dialogue. If I'm taking into that conversation some parameters, then that's monologue. And there's two forms of monologue here that Isaacs talks about: skillful conversation and debate. Skillful conversation can look very much like dialogue. It's very rational, it's very polite, but it's not dialogue. Now, the dialogic coach focuses on dialogue and goes into that conversation not without any assumptions at all or prejudices, because that's impossible, but it can see them almost like floating by, noticing what the little voice is saying, notice what the assumptions are, and is able just to watch them go and isn't subject to them. Whereas if I'm in the monologic mode, I'm not necessarily aware that I'm even carrying some assumptions into this conversation, and I'm more subject to them. So the dialogic coach, as I'm defining it here, is focusing on creating a space in which people are best able to think outside the boundaries and come up with new possibilities. As a dialogic coach, I recognize that that's a creative process and that it's a co-creative process. As a coach, I'm not kind of like an outside observer. I am part of that creative process. Everything I say contributes to the outcome as it emerges. So you take, if 5 different coaches were to coach the same person, the outcome would probably be different in each case because I'm a co-creator. It's quite a different perspective on coaching. So to engage in dialogue, the coach needs to be aware of the coach's assumptions and boundaries, and that includes some of the things that we hold dearly around coaching. So it includes assumptions or beliefs like, I must get a goal, I must get an action plan, coaching must do their homework. The dialogic coach is going to hold those kinds of things more lightly. And like Alfred E. Newman, is just going to kind of trust that change will emerge. Because the change research says that this is actually how change happens generally. Change emerges from dialogue at an organizational level, team level, individual level. Okay, so what might a dialogic approach to coaching look like? In this case, Adam says, I want to be more influential again. In this case, Jill isn't assuming that she knows what he means. What does influential mean? Well, it means that people will seek out my perspective. Jill then shares with Adam what she thinks he's talking about, her own experience. She might get it right, she might get it wrong. It's another aspect of dialogue. Dialogue is not just about listening, it's about listening and voicing. Whereas the traditional coach may sometimes think, well, my job is simply to ask questions. The dialogic coach is very happy to to participate in the conversation. So as you can see, I'm not going to read this all through. Adam and Jill continue to explore this issue, and Adam comes up with an insight. Now, during this whole conversation, Jill has not been focused on coming up with a goal. She's not been more concerned about, oh, is there an action plan going to come up here? She has a confidence that if she succeeds in creating this space for dialogue, that Adam's intentions will emerge, change will emerge. And what she's listening for is not just the words that Adam says. And that's where I get a little puzzled about phrases like active listening and listening harder. It's kind of a different type of listening. She's not just listening to the words. She's really listening for the meaning behind the words and even for the person behind those words. Who is this person I'm talking to? And often in coaching, the coaches themselves may not. Well, none of us are completely self-aware.
Hey, Paul.
So these insights emerge.
I'm sorry to interrupt for one quick second, but speaking of listening, we're hearing a lot of background noise. Is it possible to put on a headset so that the background noise can be reduced? I'm going to ask everyone to check one more time and make sure that they are muted. Thank you.
Shall I go on?
Sorry for the interruption, Paul. Please continue.
No, that's all right. Okay. So the dialogic approach has implications. And one implication is that the coach is going to be really quite interested in bringing other people into the room because change emerges from dialogue. And so the more people that are engaged in the dialogue, then the kind of more convergent, the more divergent and the more creative that conversation is likely to be. And so unlike the coachee I was talking about before, who really didn't want to go anywhere near the organisation or other stakeholders, the dialogic coach is really interested in bringing other stakeholders into the conversation. The dialogic coach is more likely to contract around what's confidential, because often coachees say, you know what, 90% of what we talked about, and maybe for you to talk about. And so by taking that conversation outside the room to the line manager or the organisation, again, we're extending the scope of the dialogue. As I said before, the dialogic coach feels more, has permission to speak, to voice, and isn't going to be so absolutely focused on goals coming up with a goal at the end of half an hour or end of first session. Has that confidence that goals will emerge, intention will emerge, and by the way, will change and evolve over the course of an assignment. So that's traditional, that's dialogic, and Sam, now I'm going to come back to the systemic, and then close off part one and get into part two, which is around some of the practical stuff. Now, the systemic approach through this lens is really an extension of the dialogic mindset. If from the dialogic perspective, I'm very focused on my relationship with the coachee. If I'm thinking systemically, I go, oh, okay, change emerges from the relationship, from the dialogue between people. So there is change happening all over this organization. And so I'm conscious that what I say may have a ripple effect beyond the coaching room. I'm conscious that what's going on inside of the room is very much impacted by the dialogue that happens outside the room. And I'm very conscious that the coachee is engaging in dialogue with other people in between our sessions. So I've just have that mindset, that awareness of the system. And this changes the way I relate to my coachee. So, for example, if my coachee comes back to a session and says, oh, you know, I said I'd do this, but I didn't do it. Instead of kind of a traditional perspective saying, oh, well, you're obviously someone who doesn't do what they say they're going to do, or whatever the little voice says. From a systemic perspective, I'm just really curious about that. Because what may have happened is the in the conversation between the two of us and the dialogue between the two of us, a clear intentions emerged, but that intention seems to have become something different through dialogue with others. So what were those conversations? What's happened? So I get curious. So that systemic, in that, if I'm looking at it from a systemic perspective as coach, I'm sitting there in the coaching room. I'm recognizing that change is constantly emerging. I'm seeking to understand patterns of dialogue across the system. I see leadership as systemic, not purely individualistic. And that ambiguity, that uncertainty is just normal. And I'm happy about that, and I'm curious about that. So that was a pretty swift scroll through traditional dialogic systemic. I'm going to go on to the practical stuff. I'm defining systemic here then as being, and as I said, that lots of people will define this differently, but I'm defining systemic as being conscious of the broader system in terms of the relationships between people and the patterns of dialogue in that system. So here's the poll. Julie, you're going to run the poll, or do I read the poll? Oh, there it is. Yeah. So what approach do you adopt? And you may adopt more than one, but mostly traditional, mostly dialogic, mostly systemic, or depends on the context. Or, Paul, you lost me on slide 1 there. I'm not really sure what you're talking about.
Okay, thanks, folks, for answering the poll. Please continue. We're just about halfway through. If everyone can quickly answer and join in and let us know what's going on. So far, it looks good. Nobody's answered, I don't know what you're talking about. So that's good. Okay, we've got just about everyone. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to make a final decision. All right. I'm going to end the poll. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to share the results. And it looks like it depends on the context is the most popular answer. Hello. Paul, we lost you there for a second.
Cool. Depends on the context. Yeah, sorry about that. I just seemed to disappear. Are my slides still there, or shall I put them back up?
Yeah, we lost your slides. If you can put them back up. There we go. Great.
Are we right?
Yep, now we're good. Thank you.
Depends on the context. Beautiful. Yeah, that was convenient. I got kicked out exactly halfway. Lovely. So nobody picked 5. That's a bit of a relief. So I need to get rid of that poll. There we go. The practical bit. Now, here's the thing. If I'm coaching from a systemic mindset, then that it's a very emergent way of working. I'm not going in with a predetermined kind of toolkit necessarily. Otherwise, I'd be going in the conversation somewhat monologic. There's no man, but here's some things that you might find yourself doing. I've picked 5 things here. Number 1, sketching the system. Oops, you're not supposed to see that one yet. Here we go. Sketching the system. So this is a actual story about Bob. Bob's the person who's sitting there looking rather unhappy at the moment. Bob is a clinician at a hospital, and he was asked to run a project with Lorna, whereby they'd come up with a common way of doing things across the 2 hospitals based on some really good stuff that Bob had done. So Bob worked with Lorna. Lorna wasn't terribly keen, but Bob put some recommendations up to the COO and CEO anyway. But those recommendations have got stuck. He's just not getting a reply, and they keep saying they need more time. Bob's really unhappy about this because a lot of people have participated in this project of his, and now they think that he doesn't have any influence. And Dr. B, who he doesn't really know, is getting really quite cross with Bob because he wants Bob's system in Lorna's hospital. Bob doesn't want to give it to him because he knows if he just gives him the system without retraining people, then the system won't work. So Bob's not very happy. So what Bob did was sketch the system, and this is kind of how he sketched it. So notice here how he sketched the system. He sketched a hierarchy: CEO at the top, then COO, then himself and Lauren, and then the doctors at the bottom. So what that's telling us is, or what Bob decided it was telling him, was that he does have a somewhat hierarchical mindset. Then and that's partly why he's unhappy. Now, when we then sort of played around with this, then it started looking like this. And the key to this was Bob noticed that his relationships with the COO and the CEO and Dr. A were actually very good. The doctor's relationships with the COO and CEO weren't good, and Lorna didn't have terribly good relationships with anyone. Bob also had a very good relationship with the global research community, which is why the CEO and COO were very keen for him to do the role. His so two big insights for Bob here. One was, actually, he has a lot more power in this system than he'd appreciated. It's relational power. And if anybody has more power than Bob, it's the doctors. Because the doctors can choose to work in these hospitals or not. They're not employees. But the hospitals really need them. So they actually have as much, if not more power than the CEO and COO. It's just a different kind of power. And so from sketching the system and thereby thinking more systemically, what Bob then chose to do was he sat down with Dr. A, who had a very good relationship with Dr. B. They talked about his project. Dr. A and Dr. B went and said to the CEO and COO, this needs to happen now. And within about 2 weeks, the project was approved. So I find myself, this is a very simple example, but I find myself using this a lot. It helps coaches to think systemically. Coachees to think systemically. And of course, there's physical versions of this using figures and so on. And the constellation work, I think, has quite a lot in common. So chatbox, I need to find the chatbox again, but chatbox question, who actually feels comfortable with this idea of sketching the system? Oh, good. Absolutely, I do. Yes. Not a sketch. Yes, I like it a lot. Not often enough. Helps the client to visualize it. Used it for 20 years. Wow, Jane. Okay. Not sure what to include. Don't use it often enough. Yeah, funny. When the don't use it often enough question I quite like, because when someone introduced me to this, it sort of felt a bit artificial, and so I didn't necessarily use it. But once I started using it, it just became a very natural thing to use. And I don't go into sessions thinking I'm going to sketch the system, but it's just something like any other model where you have these sort of models and things in your head, just pops up as being useful. And for Marion, it's really it include just to start talking about the issue and just start sketching the aspects of it that appear pertinent to you and the coachee. I'm going to move us on because I'm looking at time. Bringing the system into the room, Brendan. Now, bringing the system into the room, I'm going to focus on a example here, which is the three-way meeting, and I don't want to limit us to that. But I did some research on three-way meetings where some people were kind enough to let me record their three-way meetings, and it was really interesting because some very different patterns of interaction emerged. Pattern number one, the conversation was essentially between the coach and the line manager. The coach said, hey, here's what the coachee is working on. What do you think? And the coachee kind of sat there quietly. Pattern number two, which is more common, coach would say to coachee, hey, coachee, what are you working on? And then would say to the manager, hey, what do you think about what the coachee is working on? So the energy, again, the coachee and manager didn't talk to themselves very much. Pattern three, everybody was talking to each other. And in pattern four, the coachee and line manager were doing most of the talking, and the coach was just kind of sitting there because it was all going very well and didn't see the need to really facilitate. Now, I don't know what your practice is in this space, but it was very interesting to me because I think patterns 3 and 4 are potentially offer us more in the systemic space. So, for example, I was working with someone recently where the line manager turned up late to this three-way, and what the coachee was actually working on was whenever he appeared in front of the board, he'd talk and talk and talk with lots and lots of energy, but there was a perception that that he didn't listen, and he didn't get that, and he thought it was wrong. Anyway, the line manager walked in while the coach, because he was late, the coach was busy explaining to me something completely different, a problem on the wall, and I got really into it. And he said to the line manager, join us in this, solving this problem. And the line manager said, no, I'm here to talk about your coaching. And the coach said, no, let's talk about this problem. And this went on for about 5 minutes. And I was able to reflect back to them, as they were both getting frustrated, what I was experiencing. And they both found it very useful. And the coachee particularly found it useful because it was in microcosm what was happening in the broader system between him and the board. So if you bring a line manager, or for that matter, anybody else into the room, you are able as a coach to work with that little part of the system. It's not just about asking the line manager to help contribute to forming the goal. That's what 3 ways are often formed for. There's a systemic dimension to it, which you can, which provides us with lots of interesting data. So my chat box question: are you a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or a 4, or you just don't do 3 ways at the moment? Sarah's a 4. Lovely. Depends on context. Absolutely. 3, 2 and 3. So while people are answering, I do like the depend on context piece. Again, I'm really trying hard here. Systemic is not about going in with a predetermined way of doing things. That there may be other factors going on in the system that you've already noticed that says, in this particular instance, I think it's going to be safest for me to do most of the talking with the line manager. So again, I'm not advocating, hey, everybody do 3 and 4. There's a kind of broader systemic framework around all of this. Number 3, encouraging feedback. Might sound a bit obvious. Yeah, Jane, have to build bridges to get to 4. Lovely. Encouraging feedback. Now, if we think about the organisation as a complex system, and we hold on to that piece around volatility, then it says that one of the things that leaders really need to do is be eliciting feedback on an ongoing basis. Lots of organizations use 360 surveys. And those 360 surveys, a lot of the companies who market the 360 surveys say things like, there's not much point in doing them more than once a year. After 2 years, the kind of wisdom in the 360 has probably worn out. Now, I'm not at all critiquing 360s necessarily here. What I am saying, though, is the system has lots of dimensions to it. How I'm perceived in different parts of the system will be different. A 360 isn't going to capture that. And the system is constantly changing. So whilst using a 360 may be useful, where I can really be helpful to a coachee is to help them build into just the way they do things. The skills, the ability, the commitment to build and maintain those feedback loops. When I did the research on change, I did some research on change where I interviewed 50 leaders around the world to say, hey, how did you do successfully lead change in a complex system? Lots of things emerged, dialogue being one of them, systemic perspective being the other. Those were the 2 main things. But what nearly all these leaders talked about was having a number of people all over the system who they could go to get at different levels of the system to give them feedback on an ongoing basis. So really building in the whole feedback piece into coaching, again, is the kind of thing a systemic coach might do. So the chat box question: who feels comfortable encouraging feedback? Who does make a point of helping their coachees build feedback loops? Oh, yeah, getting answers. I do. Could do more of it. I might think I could. Yes, definitely comfortable. If you want to read up, there's a lovely book by Mark Kahn. I think it's called Coaching Leading on the Edge, where he writes a lot about the whole piece around feedback. So lots of yeses and encouragings, and definitely comfortable with it. Number 4, collaborating. So here's another thing. I actually worked in the system as a client at one point. And I remember trying to work, and it was a bank actually, where coaching wasn't centralized. And to get coaches to talk to me was actually quite challenging. I worked at a coaching firm, that's where I met Angela, worked at a coaching firm where coaches working on the same client or the same project would often get together to exchange their observations of that client and share those observations with the client themselves. Some coaches didn't like that. They said, I'm really uncomfortable having any sort of a conversation with anybody else about my coachee. And some coaches said, well, if you want me to participate in those conversations, you need to pay me, stuff like that. I'm just going to take a break. Brendan, I will distribute the name of that book after. I'll go and look it up in my bookshelves during the Q&A session. So the collaboration piece, if I'm systemic, then wow, any opportunity that I can get to have a conversation with other coaches working in that system, I'm going to be up for that, because I recognize that in this system, it's complex and there's going to be different things going on in different parts of the system. And so by talking to other coaches in that system, then it broadens my horizons, it broadens my understanding of that system. And as part of my offering, I'm probably going to be talking to the client, the person who buys coaching services, about the value of doing this and how it would be lovely to sit and meet with you, because you can give us some perspectives on the organization that we don't have access to. And we as coaches can give you some perspectives on this organization that will be very useful to you. Now, of course, confidentiality comes up. But again, this is the difference between confidentiality, i.e. I just don't talk about it, that's the safest way. The difference between strict confidentiality and contracting, where I'm talking to my coachees at the same time saying, what are you happy for me to talk about? What do you not want me to talk about? So another dimension of a systemic coach is that desire, I'd say, not willingness, but hunger to collaborate with others. So let me ask, who feels comfortable collaborating in that way with clients and other coaches? Belinda does it all the time. Deb, totally. Usually, yes. Wow, we've just got a whole load of systemic coaches. Brilliant. Yeah, contracting. I love that, Carol, when it's been agreed up front. I haven't talked about contracting a lot. I think contracting is really important. I'll keep my eye on the chat box and move on. Now, I said up front, it isn't about necessarily having a manual. Sometimes you'll just, with the sort of systemic perspective, you'll end up doing something you didn't think you were going to do. I'll give you an example of something I never thought I'd do. And this was when the client, the paying client, said, we want you to coach this person. I said, all right. And they said, instead of like a 10-month assignment with 10 sessions, we want you to do the 10 sessions in 2 days, because we want to really accelerate the coaching, because this person needs to really speed up their development because they're on the brink of losing their job. Now, all my kind of traditional coaching antennae all prickled up. And I thought to myself, all warning signs going off here. This sounds, first of all, this conversation around him potentially losing his job, this sounds quite remedial, for want of a better word. And how can you coach someone in 2 days? I mean, the whole principle of coaching is you have a bit of a reflective conversation. They go do stuff, you come back, you reflect. But I thought about it purely from a dialogic perspective, and thought, all right, well, if coaching partly is about the value of dialogue, then maybe we can do something. I'll at least have a chat to the coachee. Spoke to the coachee, who said, yeah, I'm not really very sure why they want to do this. I think they told me it is about polishing my rough edges because I am next in line to be the CEO. And I thought, ooh, he's telling me that he's next in line to be CEO. The CEO and the HR manager are telling me that he's about to be made redundant. So that's starting to tell me something about the system as well, in terms of openness of dialogue and feedback giving. So I did get a little bit of supervision on this, but what we ended up doing was I devised a 3-day intervention for them. The first day I spoke to a lot of the folks in his world, including the line manager and the CEO, and said, how would you feel about giving this person feedback direct with me in the room? And nearly all of them said, we'd be happy with that. And we had some conversations about how to do that effectively and the extent to which they were genuinely comfortable. That was after I had a conversation with the coachee who said, I would really like to do that. I'd really like to get the feedback direct, and I'm up for it, and I'm not going to be defensive. And I just really need to know this feedback. And so day one, I talked to all the coachees, all the feedback givers. Day two was basically a whole load of 3-ways. Each feedback giver giving feedback direct to the coachee. And day 3 we left open. We said on day 3 we would use that based on whatever came out of day 2. By the way, I did manage to convince them 3 days rather than 2 days, and we did spread it over 2 weeks rather than 2 days. And what emerged from that was he himself had got a completely different understanding of how he was being perceived in the organisation. Number one. Number two. All these people that gave him feedback actually enjoyed the process because he received it so beautifully. And so he then had these ongoing feedback loops with which to work. And number 3, I was able to have a conversation with the CEO and the HR manager about the nature, about what we'd learned about the organisation through this intervention, and how they realised these kind of feedback loops were just closed all over the organisation, and that then took us into another piece of work. Now, I'm not advocating that as a standard process because it was the right process for that scenario. There are some scenarios in which if you did something like that, it could be quite counterproductive. I'm just giving you an example of the kind of innovative, creative thing that can happen if you're looking at coaching through that kind of dialogic systemic lens. And it's really interesting because when I tell that story to some people, they say, hey, Paul, interesting, that's not coaching, that's consulting. And then we get into whole conversations around what do we mean by coaching, what do we mean by consulting. My chatbot's question is, who does feel comfortable innovating in that sort of way? Do people have examples of having innovated in that sort of way? I don't mean in that sort of way as in same outcome, but having done something really quite unexpected that's been useful. Now, I've just gone quiet, Julie, because I'm looking at the chat box.
Thanks, everyone, for participating.
Yeah, okay. Cool. We will have about 5 minutes for Q&A. So, here's something you to fix that. Just starting out. The last bit, I do want to... Here's the model again. Baba. Here's the model. I want to talk about this coach development bit. You can listen to what I've been. It sounds like a lot of you are already doing this stuff. If some aspects of this are new, you may be listening to what I'm saying conceptually and be thinking about it in terms of skills and knowledge. But there is a piece here about the perspective that we take, the way that we look at the world. And this is Keegan theory. I'm not going to do Keegan theory here and now, or I can refer you off to some references. But basically, he talks about, for adults, the socialized mind, the self-authored mind, the self-transforming mind. Now, those are 3 different perspectives, 3 different ways of looking at the world, and they're quite intrinsic to who we are. If I look at the world through a socialized mind, I basically am very much beholden to the views and beliefs of other people. If I look at the world through a self-authored mind, I have quite a fixed view on how the world operates. I have a pretty fixed view on what are the right values, what are the right ways of doing things. If I have a self-transforming mind, I'm able to kind of elevate myself. Not able to, this is how I think. And I think about how people have lots of different values, and I'm very much tuned into the relationships and interactions. So having a kind of self-transforming mind might be quite a helpful way to think when I'm working systemically. The question then is, okay, how do I get a self-transforming mind? And it's not something that you go to class to go and learn, but the literature around this says we do as adults tend to change the way we think when our current way of thinking is not serving us well. So what that gives us a bit of a clue as to is, if I want to really be thinking more systemically, intrinsically, then it would be quite helpful, perhaps, to put myself outside my comfort zone. Go and start doing some stuff in the one-to-one space that I'm not entirely comfortable with. Maybe I'm going to go and try doing some of that group team coaching I've never done, even though I'm if I recall back to my own experience, even though I'm terrified, to actually put yourself just outside your comfort zone with someone to help you reflect, to help you navigate that new environment, and to help you reflect. And that's how I think about supervision. Supervision gets talked about in coaching, some coaching quarters, as this thing where I need someone who's a better coach than me, a more experienced coach, to tell me if I'm doing the right thing. That's not really how I think about supervision. My own perspective is supervision is more about reflective practice. It's a study of what I can see and what I can't see, and that's something to be able to get that kind of insight. Reflecting by myself in a little dark room probably isn't going to cut it. And so the supervisor in this perspective is my reflective partner. So I'm talking about supervision here as a form of reflective practice with a role to play, a really interesting, useful role to play, and helping me to think differently, thereby to become more systemic, if I want to become more systemic. So our last poll, curious, do you undertake supervision?
Okay, I've just launched the poll. Supervision is in progress now. Please look at your polls and tell us if you engage in supervision or undertake supervision. Okay, we've got a lot of people answering. Thanks for participating. Okay, we're just about coming up on a minute. In about 20 more seconds, I'm going to close the poll. There's still a couple of you who haven't answered. If you can quickly answer, we'll get some really good information here. Okay, I'm going to end the poll.
Ta-da.
All right, yes, peer supervision. I'm sharing the results so everyone can see how it's spread across the board.
Beautiful. Lovely. Thank you. That's very interesting. I'm doing quite a lot of research on group supervision at the moment, so that's really useful. Now, last of all, I'm nearly finished. The book that I was talking about is by Mark Simon Kahn. That's Kahn, and it's called Coaching on the Axis. Not whatever I said it was called. It's called Coaching on the Axis, Working with Complexity in Business and Executive Coaching. It's a lovely little book. In terms of my own stuff, that's the book, Coaching in 3 Dimensions, which is coming out later this year. Also did a book on leading change. Now that leading change book is all about dialogue, and it looks at change through a sort of dialogic lens. The chapter in the Sage Handbook has got a lot of stuff around adult development and coaching that I alluded to when I was talking about the Keegan model. And the Tower of Dialogue is coming out later this year. All this stuff around dialogue, there really isn't a reference that tells us, in simple terms, what do we mean, and that's what that book's about. So if all the references here, if you want any of these, and you will get the slides after, just send me an email, because I can give you soft copies of any of this stuff, and do link me in. And that's it. So I'm not sure I did brilliantly with time there, but we've got about 3 minutes for questions, I think.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Paul Lawrence, for joining us today and sharing such great information. I'm just looking through here, and I'm not sure that we have questions. I think you covered it very well. We did confirm that Paul is going to share the slides, and we'll send out a separate email with the link to those slides. And also, just so everyone knows, that this meeting was recorded. So as soon as we have a chance to go through it, we'll post that.
Can I just say, Adriana's just said, can we have your email? You can, but just link me in. And I don't call myself Dr. Paul Lawrence. I'm just Paul. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for the clarification, Paul.
That's all right.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to actually share my screen now. If everyone, since we're sharing the slides, you'll have that opportunity to look at those references yourselves. I am now going to share my screen to say thank you and to remind you all that tomorrow the People Science SIG will be covering Generation Z, planning for the next wave of employees, and that will be at the library from 6 to 7. Go ahead and consult the atdny.org website for more information if you haven't already signed up. We'd like to thank Angela for setting this whole thing up. And again, Paul, thank you so very much for all your time and preparation. And folks, we thank you for joining us and bearing with us as we try out our new Zoom platform. And we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.